My name is retired detective Anthony Torres. 16 years in the 44th precinct in the South Bronx. 6 years in the counterterrorism bureau. How it was like to grow up in the South Bronx. I lived in the Jackson projects till I was 12. At that time, the demographics was different. I tell a lot of people that graphics were different. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, at the time, in those projects, we had the Polish, Puerto Ricans, the Italians, the Germans, and the Puerto Ricans. Well, I think I said Puerto Ricans right here, but I said, what race did I not name? And they would like, no black family. I'm like, one black family at that time in those projects. So, I like to tell them that because things change along the way. I mean, who knows what different demographics will be there next time. So after, it was a rough time. A lot of gangs at that time. A lot of alcohol abuse, not with my parents, but other kids' parents. So there was a lot of violence.
What is the time period that we're talking about?
From 65 to 77?
Okay.
Yeah. Or 70, 72.
Okay. So this is your coming of age, your childhood. And
yeah, kind of like, hey, your street smarts by all means. There were a lot of kids getting hit by cars at that time because we'd run out in the street. And, drivers then didn't really adhere to the stop signs and lights that you'd hear now too, Okay. Elevators that didn't have the photo eye anymore, or didn't have a photo eye at that time, were hurting and injuring a lot of people. Fires. That area that was the South Bronx was synonymous to that series, The Bronx is Burning. I don't know if you heard that, but I witnessed a lot of fires in my younger years.
Oh. So would you say you grew up with fear then? A certain amount of fear? Or a sense of community?
Well, there was a sense of community in the poor neighborhoods. Everybody kind of took care of each other. But you knew that, you're going out with your friends and stuff like that, that other kids from other blocks and rival areas would try to rob you or, attack you. So you always had that, sense of be careful.
Okay.
Your street smarts were definitely sharpened there, you might say.
So what was your attitude toward the police at the time?
I didn't really interact too much with police because I was younger, but I did see a lot of drugs being dealt with in the street, where they would just, grab them, throw them in the police car, and off they go. A lot of mental health, because the housing police showed up a lot of times in our housing complex because of at that time I don't think we had bars in front of the windows for children so they couldn't fall out, and a lot of mentally ill people would just throw everything out of the windows, throw furniture out the window, throw clothes out the window. It was insane. Oh. Interesting, for a little kid. It's kind of interesting, everything's fascinating. Like, wow, you saw that? Yeah, they threw a whole bureau out the window. Yeah, it's like, wow. So I went. My father had to go to an emergency room for some reason, and he had to take me with him. And while I was waiting there's a guy that had gotten stabbed and shot, and they wheeled him like right in front of me because I was sitting down, and he's moaning. And he kind of like looks at me like, "Yeah, I'll be all right." I'm like, "Wow, look at that." So we ended up moving from there and going to a nicer neighborhood.
In the Bronx?
No, we went to Roseville Island.
Ah.
Roseville Island was a newer community. It was actually great. It was a fantastic community. We still have reunions to this day.
Oh.
We were kind of like the first kids of Roseville Island.
Wow.
Yeah, that's cool.
So, okay, before you tell me why you became a police officer, did you feel a sense of community, not just with your friends, but your, like, the families and the neighborhood?
In the Bronx, or
Yeah, in the Bronx. No, Roosevelt Island, I know it's
yes,
great, but
at that time they had this group called the Tenant Patrol, and I think I see some factions of it every once in a while. But yes, the working people from the projects always grew together, and tried to stick together and do barbecues together, parties together, and looked out for each other. A lot of people just didn't have enough money to eat, and people would give them food and stuff like that.
oh,
They'd feed their children. Same things happening in poor communities now, all over the United States.
yeah. Yeah, it's like family and friends. There's no division. Friends are family,
Right.
Right?
Absolutely. I just
Yeah.
think poorer communities are more giving, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. From what I've
They're
seen.
not as tribalistic, right?
Right.
Bring everyone in.
Yeah, poverty has no color, really.
Okay. So now about the becoming a police officer. So when did you decide that you wanted to become a police officer, and what were your ideas about the police?
Well, I had just come back from college. I was like my junior year. I was working in the emergency room, and a friend of mine was like, "Why don't you take the test? The test is coming." I'm like, I don't really want to be a police officer. He's like, "What do you want to be?" I'm like, "I'm trying to be a Air Force pilot." So that was pretty much all my education was towards aviation. So he's like, "Well, while you're trying to figure it out, it wouldn't hurt to have a career that's paying you a lot of money than you're getting paid now. And then if you want to do that, you could do that later on." So I took it, and 2 years later, actually 4 years actually, because I ended up going into the military, going into Air Force Reserves, and got a letter during the Air Force training that I had gotten accepted by the police department. So when I came back, it was still being delayed because I guess they missed a couple of classes. And by the time I got called into the police department, I was already a sergeant in the Air Force. So I was a lot older than most that were in the police department.
Okay.
I ended up being like 30 years old when I got in there. I was in good
Great.
shape. I was
Okay.
already, so
All right.
that didn't.
So now how did you then find yourself in the South Bronx serving that community?
It's an
And
interesting
what was it
question.
like at first?
Yes, it was interesting because I took the test for transit, because at that time it was 3 different departments that you can put in for. So I put in for transit because I had friends that are in transit. Bratton was the transit commissioner at that time. It was revamping transit. It was looking really great. It had all technology and stuff like that. And I ended up taking transit. But while I was in the academy, all 3 departments merged, which meant that if you were transit or housing, you were kind of going to get the money, your last bits of money when it came to department resources. So I was like, oh no, I have to get to the NYPD part of this thing. So I asked one of the instructors, what should I do? He goes, put in for an A house. A house is a very active house, or better saying would be a more violent location. So I put in for the 44th precinct because I had 2 friends there that had met from the emergency room that were actually police officers in the 44th precinct. And it was in my old neighborhood, so I said, I'll try that, see what happens. And what ended up happening is I got my wish. A lot of people, have a dream list and they never get it. But I remember showing up to the precinct, and there were like 45 people there that were just newly assigned there. And they said, okay, who here out of the 45 of you asked to come to this precinct? And I was the only one that raised their hand. And, the other cops were like, what is this guy, crazy? So they ended up transferring a lot of those 45 and just keeping me because I had put my hand up.
Okay.
But nevertheless,
So,
it turned out to be a good thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So now you had these memories of this area.
Yeah,
and
right.
then and now you're in a different position.
Yeah,
So what was it like at first?
It was interesting because I got to see the development from when I was there, and I hadn't been there since then, you know. And I remember a captain taking me as his driver for that day and saying, "Let me give you a tour of the precinct." And I kind of laughed. I'm like, I think I know the precinct pretty good. Let me give you a tour of this precinct. So we talked about the area and the development and everything else. And for the worst, really, because at that time when I was there, we had just had Officer McDonald killed like several months before we got there. So they were still mourning that particular death there. And from there on, I mean, we stuck together. There are a lot of incidences where I talked to other rookies that had gone out, and they said, they weren't talked to by the senior members of their precinct till like 3 years later. So I'm like, wow, that's terrible. He goes, what about you? I'm like, yeah, I talk to them every day. Everybody's very friendly. Everybody was very friendly in the 44th precinct because it was such a violent area. So you getting back at the end of the day was, this is a serious accomplishment. They're the greatest police officers I've ever seen in the force.
So what made them so great?
The things they did. It was incredible. I can honestly say I would see one particular outstanding achievement that a cop had done that day. You're like, wow, what happened? It's like, well, you chased this guy, he had a knife, and they chased him like 4 blocks, and he caught him and disarmed the guy, and nobody got shot, and he arrested him. I'm like, wow. And you're so eager to get involved, and you're like waiting for those opportunities, But honestly, incredible to just see the heroics of these police officers every day.
And by heroics, you mean being able to disarm, being able to engage,
de-escalate,
reaching out,
talking to the community, knowing the community. It was just
wow.
It was insane. It was a great learning precinct because whether you're a boss or not, we all went out there and we all came back together. That was incredible. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. And it was at that time, I think it was a dumping ground for all, like, if the cop was having a problem in another precinct, they'd send him to our precinct, and they'd clear up and fly right when we got to our precinct. It was interesting.
But weren't you seen as the enemy? As a, like, say, a Latino policeman, weren't police seen as the enemy, not, to be engaged with?
Yeah, until we're seen as the enemy to criminals. Absolutely. But the community wants us there. They want us to clean up the drug dealers, the criminals, the rapists, everything's out there. This is a very violent area. And we only had a 1.8 square miles. We've got close to 450 cops in there, in that precinct. We have a Sector Thomas that comes out. That's like close to 12 police cars. That's more than the whole. There's no other precinct that sends out that many sectors.
Wow.
And we had narcotics were in there, and anti-crime, all sorts of plainclothes. The feds are in there also at the same time. It was insane. Okay. Sometimes you're like, stepping on each other's areas on patrol.
So this is interesting because now you then segued into nonviolent communication from being in the 44th precinct. And it almost seems from hearing you speak of yourself before NVC that you were on that same trajectory, that it makes sense that you then went into nonviolent communication. So maybe you want to describe how you got into NVC and then how you used it.
Well, I think a big tribute to my communication skills came from where I worked before I was a cop, and that was the emergency room. So in the emergency room, everybody's a patient. So there's no real enemy image in there. So if you have a combative individual that's mentally ill, the whole objective was to subdue this individual without causing any harm, whether it be judo, jujitsu, any type of wrestling holds that you would put in. And that was pretty much our techniques weekly in the emergency room. So that actually contributes a lot. Another thing is that patients are all around you. So no matter what you say or do, they're watching you. So when something happened, they'd say, "Hey, did you see what happened?" Yes. And I'd listen and I'd be like, "Wow, they listen to everything." It's like, yeah, the patient told him he wanted this, and he said they couldn't give it to him because of that. And then he jumped him and tried to choke him. And then Torres brought him down to the floor, and they subdued him, and they put him on a stretcher, and they tied him up, and that's really what happened. So I realized then that what I said in front of everybody was very important. So like I would say, "Mr. Williams, please, if you could just sit on the stretcher, and the doctor will be with you in a little bit." And I made sure that I said, "Is there anything I could do for you?" Or we're trying to do as much as possible within a certain time frame. He should be here at any moment, so that if something were to happen, they knew that I had given them the most opportunities possible before he would either attack me or attack one of the nurses. So I took that over to the police department, because that's pretty much the same way, right? Because now you have cameras, you have phones, but I always thought of it as people are watching, and you should set the right example. I mean, it's tough because sometimes you're in fear for your life, and you're getting jumped and you're getting attacked, and any way you can get out of it is any way you can get out of it. So that's a big factor.
Okay.
Now the NVC came in when I came back from a deployment. So I was always back. We were, at this time it's about 2008 or 7 or 8, and now we've been in the war for a while. I was activated a couple of times. A lot of times they weren't sure if I was a reserve cop or reserve military. So I was bouncing back and forth, and I saw this particular program on nonviolent communication. So each year I try to better myself within the department by taking some course, whether it be a tactical course, anything I can get my hands on. But I saw that this was nonviolent communication. I give it a shot. It was $250. It wasn't really expensive, and it was 8 weeks, every Wednesday. So I show up there, and I think I was the only male out of like 10 people there. I was like, "Oh, this is going to be interesting." This lady's apartment on 57th in like Madison, I think it was. And so I'm there and I'm listening, and it was structured with 4 concepts. It was observations, feelings, needs, and requests, and how to interpret all those. So we had exercises, and at first I was like, I don't know if I can. I had teachers in there, we had doctors in there, we had other people that weren't really accepting the training, so they were always questioning the instructor. So I'm like, okay, this could work. And they used puppets sometimes, like the giraffe puppet and the jackal puppet. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'll just take those puppets and go on patrol and be like, "Hey, here you go. Mr. Giraffe wants you to accept all feeling, and Jackal's gonna." So after a while, I started doing the exercises with the members of the class, and it started coming along. My biggest aha moment was empathy. They gave you a sheet on what empathy isn't. So there's a sheet, and I'm like, wow. I've done every single one of these things and thought it was empathy. That I was giving somebody empathy, you know what I mean? It's really more sympathy or like, the samples of the empathy sheet that we have, where you're educating or you're advising, but you're not really empathizing. You're just
or you're saying, "Oh, this happened to me."
yeah, right. So it turns around from being about you, it's being about the other person. So
yeah, I did all those.
Yes, and we all have, and I'm looking at I'm a total failure. This is terrible, right? So that was my biggest aha moment. When you finally realize that, you really learn how to listen, and the techniques that they put together, where it's feelings, and feelings in the street, and I used to call it street NVC, because I would take these techniques and I'm like, I'm going to try this out in the Bronx, see what happens, right? So I'm out there, feelings and needs. I know he's feeling angry most of the times, but I would say, I see you're upset about this particular issue. Are you? And then you would have to now try to decipher what his needs were. And what I started realizing is the need words were coming out in their sentences. So I'm like, oh, I just heard a need word. So I'd reflect that need word back to him. Like, I see what, so in retrospect, what I'm hearing, sir, is that you just want this guy to give you some consideration about what particular issue that he goes. And it was interesting because when you hit that particular need of the individual, it's a massive de-escalation. I mean, you're like, almost like, was that it? And now you have to determine and get a strategy to meet that request on that need. And I just couldn't believe that it worked out 100 times.
Yeah, I heard
every single time
100%.
I would use these techniques, it would work in a monumental way. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. This is actually working.
So no one got angry and said, who are you to say what I feel or what I need?
No, only because while I was observing and empathizing, the individual felt that I was connecting with him when I reflected his need back. And now you really have to determine now how you're going to get his request, meet his request.
Right.
It's like, why don't we talk to the individual? We tell him that you need some consideration and respect, and see what he says. And most of the time, I did it in Spanish one time, and the individual was upset that he was texting his wife. So I said, hey, listen, really what he's asking is for respect about not texting his wife on the phone. And when he realized that he wanted respect, he was like, oh, I apologize then. I didn't understand that. I thought it was okay because she was texting, she was saying that it was okay, but it really wasn't. So they kind of like, mended right there, and then went their separate ways to not be texting his wife. And I was like, yeah, that's a good idea. But I had done that in Spanish, and I was like, wow, that was interesting, because I had heard the need in Spanish.
Oh,
so that was
so
interesting.
He was feeling threatened?
Yeah, he's feeling disrespected. You know what I mean? You're this guy is texting your wife, and you don't know anything about it.
Oh.
So I show up, and he's like, hey, this guy's doing this, this, and this. I'm like, well, let's talk to him about it.
Oh.
And then we determined on a request of, please do not text his wife, because he's in need from respect and consideration from you.
Okay.
And the guy understood, said that, because it really is a communication from A to B, right?
Right.
We're not saying, hey, the guy thinks you're a jerk for doing this, and he doesn't really like your attitude, because then you're just kind of like from A to B line, you're kind of like doing this instead of going straight to his need, right?
So but it doesn't sound like this could have turned into something really violent.
Oh yeah, it could have. I mean, he could have said something.
Is that where it was going?
Yes, that's where it was going. That's why they kind of like waved me over. So I was walking to go get something, and that's when I saw them, because they were kind of arguing with each other.
Yeah.
And that's when I came in, and I was like, what happened? And he was like, okay, so this is what the deal is.
Okay.
You can respect this guy's needs for what's going on, and then everything will be good. And then the guy was like, yeah, I understand. You need respect for that. I'll respect you for that. I'm like,
So
okay, good.
now can you give another example of how you use street NVC? Just for now, another.
Oh, I'll give you, most of them are domestic. The domestic scenarios are the biggest.
Are they the
And
hardest?
no, I think the mentally ill are the hardest because you
Okay.
don't know what drug they're on,
Right.
or things can change
Okay.
real rapidly. But this was one particular episode where we were walking down the hallway and he came out of his apartment and approached us. We were kind of like, wow, it's kind of odd. Who's this? I said, did you call? He's like, yeah, I called. I just want you to mediate. I was like, oh. And we know that if he comes out of the apartment first, he wants to get his side done before we get the other side. So I'm like, well, why
Right.
don't we go inside and see what's going on? So there, thinking that everything is going to be, just mediation, is a lady that's irate with a very large frying pan in her hand. So that's her next move was going to like hit him with it. And inside was her infant baby in a high chair, her sister-in-law, and her father-in-law. So she's screaming, and I said, "Hey, I said, Sergeant, why don't you take these three and go over there and figure out what's going on, and let me speak to her." So I said, "What's going on?" So she was like, "Well, he brought his sister from the Dominican Republic, and she's got no job. He's got no job, and I have a baby, and I'm the only one working." So I said, "Okay, I understand. Let me see if I get this straight. So your need really is for financial security because of you being the only person that's able to work at this time." And she was like, "Yes." And at that one moment, when she heard me reflect that back to her, she sat down and gave me the frying pan, and everything was fine. I said, "Well, now, why don't we try to get your request met by explaining this to the group?" So I had the sergeant come over with the group, and I said, "Listen, this is the issue. It's like she has a need for financial security right now because she's the only person that's making ends meet, and she's very concerned." And so at that moment, then the father-in-law was like, I'll give you money. And then the sister was like, "I can work. I'll get a job, and we'll work this out, and I'll pay for my own way." And then the husband was like, I guess I have to get a job. I mean, he was the most reluctant to get the job. I thought that was interesting. But there you have it. Right now, here's the request. As long as you got the need out there and explained, they were right there willing to help. Because we can't really help a person's 10-year marriage in 5 minutes, but I can determine what your feelings and needs are at that one moment. So that's the important part for police officers. Like, we need to uphold the peace and make sure we don't have to get called there again where we have to arrest somebody or him knock him over the head, and now she's the one that's been working. Now she goes to jail and nobody's bringing any money inside. Make sense?
I guess there was no follow-up possible in this situation, with
No,
a social worker.
no, I did I did refer him to the NVC website for further counseling. I say I also always give them my name if they want to talk anymore in the precinct. So just give me a call if any more issues come up. We'll come by.